Donna lived with her husband Walter, who had grown increasingly controlling despite being a stay-at-home spouse. While Donna worked hard to provide for them, Walter managed the household, a setup meant to foster stability. Yet, his domineering nature undermined her efforts, making her feel as though her contributions were insignificant. One day, Walter announced, with a smug grin, that he would allow his parents to move into their home, suggesting that Donna could relocate to live with her in-laws without consulting her. Stunned into silence, she couldn't believe his audacity, especially since she owned the house. This moment marked a breaking point. She had endured Walter's overbearing behavior for too long. He often issued commands, treating her as if he were entitled to do so. Once he had demanded that she fetch him ice cream late at night while he lounged on the couch, despite her exhaustion from work. When she suggested he could get it himself, he laughed and insinuated that displeasing him could have repercussions. His behavior was not only frustrating but exhausting. Donna felt increasingly disrespected and devalued, questioning how long she could tolerate living with someone who believed he had superiority simply because he was her husband. She realized that if things didn't change, she couldn't continue this way. Walter needed to understand the impact of his actions. It was time for him to face the consequences of his domineering behavior. One evening, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her stressful job and Walter's demands, she told him, "I'm really tired. I'm going to rest in my room." His reaction was swift and challenging. "What's with that attitude towards your husband? I could kick you out right now if I wanted. Do you think it's okay to upset your spouse like that?" His fury baffled her. How could he act so authoritative without contributing financially yet crumble at the slightest inconvenience? It felt like dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "I'm sorry, but I'm exhausted. Please try to understand," she replied, forcing a smile as she tried to disengage. Walter sighed, muttering, "You're such a disappointment as a wife." Lacking the energy to argue, she simply repeated, "I'm sorry," and retreated to her room. Day by day, Walter's overbearing behavior wore her down, but she was too exhausted to confront him. Then one day she caught a severe cold, which the doctor diagnosed as stress-induced. As she lay in bed, barely able to move, she informed Walter of her condition. His response was harsh. "A cold? That's just an excuse. Go to work, you're useless." His words seemed to intensify her fever. "I won't take care of you," he declared. "This is your mess. Deal with it." Left alone in her room, she moaned from the fever, feeling too weak to care for herself and too fearful to face Walter again, fearing more verbal abuse. Her temperature soared to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fever was so intense that she lay drenched in sweat, unable even to change her soaked clothes. I lay there, contemplating how much easier life might be if I could simply fade away. Along with my grim thoughts, I endured a painful night, my fever clouding my mind. Deep down, I knew something had to change. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars took their place in the night sky, a profound sense of loneliness and doubt washed over me. I yearned for Walter's support, not to cure my fever, but just for him to bring me an ice pack, apply a cool compress, and check in on me. Instead, I was met with harsh, uncaring words that cut deep and stirred up new anxieties. I questioned why I was the only one suffering, what I had done wrong, and why things couldn't be smoother between us. As these thoughts spiraled, I couldn't hold back the tears. The pain felt unbearable. After 5 days of rest, my fever finally subsided enough for me to return to work. My colleagues and bosses expressed genuine concern, asking if I was truly okay to be back. Though I was still recuperating, I felt compelled to support our household financially and couldn't afford more time off. Their kindness touched me deeply, a stark contrast to Walter's indifference, and it nearly brought me to tears again. At that moment, a voice inside me screamed that I could no longer endure Walter's behavior. I was pushing myself too hard, ignoring the signs that this way of life was unsustainable. Deep down, I knew I couldn't continue like this without eventually collapsing under the strain. My feelings for Walter had significantly diminished, yet I lacked the energy to consider separation. Amidst this turmoil, I trudged through each day, working hard and returning home exhausted, catering to Walter's unpredictable demands. This had become my daily routine. Then one day, while I sought a moment of peace in my room, Walter called out, wanting to discuss something serious. It had been ages since we had a real conversation. Typically, he made significant decisions unilaterally, and with a heavy heart, I sat down, bracing myself for whatever was to come. To my shock, Walter announced with unexpected enthusiasm, "I'll let my parents move into this house. You can't even cook, so just leave." The first word that slipped from my mouth was "What?" He continued, "You need to leave because you're living with my in-laws." I was stunned, unable to grasp the reality of his selfish demands. The situation had reached a breaking point, and I realized something had to change. As Walter pressed on, he revealed his plans to transfer ownership of our house into his name and his parents'. He bluntly stated his intentions to divorce me and start a new life, declaring his decision final and immune to my opinions. I felt utterly disregarded, my feelings trampled by decisions made without my consent. Walter, inflated with his man-of-the-house ego, seemed solely focused on his desires. My heart sank as I confronted the reality of how impossible it was to continue living with him while ignoring my growing detachment. "Jerd, you love me so much, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I know this is shocking coming from a husband you love dearly, but I'm just trying to take care of my family. Please understand." His words, intended to sound considerate, felt more like a scolding. I wanted to shout that he was mistaken. Any affection I once felt for Walter had evaporated, leaving behind only disbelief at his selfishness and regret for not severing ties sooner. Why hadn't I left him earlier? If I had, perhaps he wouldn't have had the chance to exploit and demean me so thoroughly. I even resented my past self for being too lenient. As he watched my visible distress, Walter misread my pain as lingering love, believing I couldn't bear the thought of a divorce. But he was mistaken. My feelings for him had long faded into nothing more than disdain for a man who falsely assumed I still cared. Determined to set things straight, I said firmly, "Fine then, I'll leave." Walter gasped, clearly taken aback. He hadn't anticipated my readiness to accept the divorce and move on. He needed to understand that the version of me who always bailed him out was gone for good. From now on, whatever happened to Walter would be his burden to bear alone because our relationship was over. Seeing my resolve, Walter stood there, shocked and frozen. I seized the moment, heading to my room to pack the essentials. I knew I couldn't take any larger items today and would need to arrange for movers later. As I began to pack, Walter hurried over, perhaps finally grasping the gravity of the situation. His voice trembled with uncertainty as he asked, "Are you sure about this? If we divorce, we'll be strangers." I smiled softly and replied, "I've already fallen out of love with you. Letting go feels like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." Walter stood there, bewildered and lost. I nodded, thanked him for the years we had shared, and walked out of the house. His worried expression lingered in my mind as I made my way back to my parents' home. When I explained everything to my parents, they reacted with fury at Walter's behavior but soon calmed down, reassured by my resolve and the plan I had in place. I began to recuperate at their home, taking the first steps to initiate the divorce proceedings. After I sent the divorce papers, Walter messaged me, "Are you sure about this? I don't know if it's really a good thing." I replied, "I don't have any feelings for you anymore. If we've gone this far, there's no turning back." His message concluded with a request to expedite the divorce. "I feel so much better now that you're gone, so fill out the papers quickly." I replied, but he didn't respond. A few days later, I received the completed divorce papers from Walter, his sections already filled out. I promptly filled out my part and submitted it to the county office. Just like that, Walter and I were officially divorced. During the proceedings, we divided our assets. Walter insisted on keeping the house, so I transferred ownership to him and chose to move on. The house had never truly felt like home. It was more of a burden. Instead, I sought alimony from Walter. Walter's parents initially covered his expenses since he wasn't working, but he was now job hunting, likely planning to repay them once he found employment. However, as is often the case, reality doesn't always align with plans. A month after the divorce was finalized, I had moved out of my parents' home into a new place, enjoying a more peaceful life. Then I received a call from Walter. Honestly, it was annoying. I could guess why he was reaching out. Ignoring him might lead to more complications, so I knew I had to address it sooner or later for the sake of my future. I answered the phone with a firm, "Hello, what do you want?" I was completely fed up and wanted him to get straight to the point. Reluctantly, I listened as he pleaded, "Please help me." His desperate tone made me chuckle. Walter was clearly in a tough spot, and while part of me felt distant, another part was mildly amused by the irony of his desperation. His call caught me off guard. I hadn't expected things to deteriorate so quickly. "What's going on? You need to tell me the whole story," I replied, half amused by the situation. I suspected why Walter might be struggling, but I wanted him to lay it all out himself. With a hesitant voice, stumbling over his words, Walter began to explain. He had taken over the house after our divorce and managed fine for a month. However, he now faced a rent payment he couldn't meet due to his unemployment. Desperate, he had asked my former in-laws for help, but the rent was much steeper than anyone anticipated, about $2,500, a sum they couldn't afford on their fixed income. My former in-laws were livid, accusing him of misleading them. "This isn't what we agreed to," they insisted, placing the blame squarely on Walter. Feeling lost and unsure, he called me, nearly in tears. "I didn't realize the rent would be so high. The place is a mess now. What are you going to do about it?" Frustrated and overwhelmed, Walter was now trying to pin the blame on me. I hadn't discussed the specifics of the rent before our separation, but it was Walter's folly to assume responsibility for the house without grasping the financial commitments involved. He had pushed me away, treating me like an outsider, and now he was facing the consequences of his decisions. Despite this, he seemed unable to accept responsibility and reached out to me for help. I couldn't help but sigh at his audacity. Ignoring the strain in his voice, Walter continued urgently, "Please, I need your help. We can't keep going like this. I need you." His desperation was palpable. The rent due date had likely already passed, which meant they might already be behind on payments. The landlord of that house was known for being temperamental and strict about deadlines. I recalled the warnings I had received while living there. Never be late with the rent. Missing a payment could lead to serious repercussions. Walter, having met the landlord a few times, knew exactly how intimidating they could be. When Walter called me, pleading for assistance, he said, "Please just cover the rent for 1 month. I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right? If someone you care about is in trouble, you should help them out." His tone was still self-centered, as if he hadn't changed at all. I wanted to tell him that my feelings for him had long since faded, but instead, I held back and replied coldly, "I'm sorry, but I don't have any obligation to help you. You were the one who cut me off. And now you expect me to assist you when it's convenient for you? That's not fair." Walter tried to defend himself. "Please don't be so cold. I really can't handle this alone. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We were married once, right? Can't you help me out just this once?" "No," I responded firmly. "You were the one who left me. Even before that, my feelings for you had already cooled. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you." Hearing the dejection in his voice, he said, "I can't believe it." His words struck a deep chord within me. For so long, I had endured everything, even when Walter was selfish, took me for granted, or mistreated me, especially when I was sick. I had stayed by his side, hoping to salvage our marriage. I had worked tirelessly for the life we built, yet this was the outcome. Why hadn't I left sooner, when my love for him faded? Why hadn't I distanced myself earlier? Regrets flooded in, mingling with the anger I felt toward him. Walter never truly faced me. He never showed real concern, never protected me, and never embraced the idea of navigating life together as a team. All this time, he treated me like a maid, a mere money-making machine. Each time he acted this way, he seemed oblivious to my suffering. And now, despite all this being a result of his actions, he came pleading for help, as if he were the victim. His self-centered attitude was repelling. "Please help me, I'm begging you. What about getting married again? Let's start over properly this time. I promise I'll never push you away again," he proposed desperately. I felt a mix of incredulity and annoyance. How could he think a simple plea for help could erase the years of neglect and misunderstanding? His desperation was evident, but so was my clarity in deciding not to fall back into the same pattern. I had moved on, and it was time for Walter to do the same. I chuckled bitterly at his desperate suggestion. "Are you kidding me? All of this is a result of your actions. I've been trying to find peace in my own way for a long time. I kept hoping you would face reality. And now you want me to start over with you, pretending none of this ever happened. Do you expect me to return to those miserable days? That's never going to happen." I refused to go back to that life, no matter what. Emotions overwhelmed me, and tears began to flow. I couldn't tell if they were from anger or sadness. Walter remained silent on the other end, having nothing to say in response to my words. Unable to continue the conversation, I simply said goodbye and hung up. Walter didn't call back, and to avoid hearing his voice ever again, I blocked his number. Later, I heard from mutual friends that Walter and his family had been evicted. He had tried to persuade my former in-laws to cover his rent, but they were furious and refused his request, further upsetting the landlord. With no other options, they were forced to leave. Walter hadn't had much luck finding a full-time job and was now working part-time to make ends meet. Meanwhile, my former in-laws had to sell their house and were now crammed into a rundown apartment, all three of them together. As for me, I focused deeply on my work, and my boss even discussed a promotion. There's a possibility I might become the first female manager in our company, and I've received admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Sometimes friends ask if I'm thinking about marrying again. Honestly, after my past experiences, I have a rather negative view of marriage. The idea of dating or marrying again doesn't appeal to me right now. But life is long, and there's no rush. Many people in this generation live happily unmarried. What matters most to me is living without regrets and staying true to myself. With that in mind, I want to continue navigating life at my own pace, embracing whatever comes my way with strength and independence.